sons and grandsons, and the future generations that would follow him. If there were trustees to see that the pictures were kept intact, Fedora had never heard of them, and she fancied that, if they had ever existed, most of them must be now dead. But there were no need for trustees or guardians to preserve what every Colwyn thought of as something so precious that in the past they had died to preserve it, and were prepared to do so again. Looking around the walls, she thought it was astounding to see pictures that any museum would have pleaded on their knees to possess. There was a Holbein, which portrayed the artist's uncannily shrewd insight into human nature, and the colours in his unique style seemed to tone in a remarkable way with the Hogarth hanging next to it. Because she knew that she could not bear to part with either of these, Fedora looked at a lovely Fragonard in which her father had told her realism and abstraction achieved a uniquely even balance. It was a picture that Alexander Colwyn would often stand looking at for a long time, and she knew that whatever else was sold, she could not deprive him of that one. Instead, she hesitated in front of a Raeburn. It was conspicuous with its vigorous modelling, its robust colouring and, as her father had said so often, its understanding of character.
"What an artist!"
he had exclaimed only the previous week.
"And he made no sketches, but painted straight onto a canvas."
There was despair in Fedora's large eyes, as she turned from the Raeburn to a Van Dyck, that showed in his inimitable manner an owner of Mount Sorrel with the house behind him, his hat on his head, a stick in his hand, as if he was about to walk through the gardens to inspect some part of his estate. But she knew as she looked at them that whatever else went the family portraits must remain intact, and she said again, as if she was speaking to herself rather than to Jim, who was beside her, "We must not touch anything in this room."
"There be a number piled up again the wall next door."
Fedora gave a little cry. "Papa is working on those. He would be aware immediately if one was missing. It would have struck a stranger entering the house that in the otherwise shabby dilapidated building, every painting on the walls shone with the brilliance of a polished jewel. It was as a comparatively young man that Alexander Colwyn came into his sadly depleted inheritance, and he decided that he must do something about the pictures. Because they had been neglected, despite the fact that they were still proud of them, both by his father and his grandfather, some were bulging from their frames, others had paint peeling off them, and every one had darkened with age, so that the original colour and beauty was obscured. Alexander Colwyn, when he was at Oxford, had made friends with a man who inherited a great house and a magnificent collection of paintings besides a respected title. He had also inherited enough money with which to keep his treasures in the style they deserved. Alexander Colwyn had stayed with him on several occasions, and had learnt who was the best restorer in the country to work on his pictures so that they should look as they had when they first left the artist's studio. On finding out who the man was, Alexander Colwyn had not only called to see him in London, but had persuaded him to accept him as a pupil, to learn a skill in which he found there were few men who were really proficient. When he returned home, he started on his own pictures, working on them one by one, until he had restored them to their original perfection. What had started as a necessity became a joy and an interest that was more than a hobby. Indeed, as Fedora sometimes teased him, it was almost a professional career. Many of his friends begged Alexander's help for their own collections, and he was only too pleased to oblige them. It was Fedora who thought bitterly, as her father was thanked but obviously expected no payment for his services, that to buy the materials necessary for the restoration of rich men's treasures, they had to go without food. In the last year, however, Alexander Colwyn had not been well.